Welcome to Wimmer's Wilderness. I'm your host, George Wimmer. I have 30 years of volunteer work, community organizing, and 16 years in local government, 12 of those as mayor. Wimmer's Wilderness is an informed look at politics, community, government, environment, and education from a local perspective. In episode 50, we're going to discuss the presidency. As the presidential election comes to a close on November 3rd, it's important to understand the position, its powers, and how did it evolve over time. Make sure you stick around till the end of our podcast to play our quiz. You'll have a chance to win our Wimmer's Wilderness Mason glass drinking jar, the recycled cardboard pen, and our very popular reusable-retractable drinking straw. We also have a special $50 gift to celebrate our 50th episode. So, as I said, today's podcast, we're going to talk about the presidency, and we're going to kind of break it down into three general areas, and things crisscross back and forth across all of these, but this is how we're breaking it down. The first area that we're going to go through is what is the American presidency. Second is how do we pick a president? And then lastly, how has that office of the presidency evolved over time? Let's get started with, what is the American presidency? Article 2 of the Constitution, and although some presidents think that the presidency is the most powerful and really should be Article 1, it's actually Article 2. So in Article 2 of the Constitution, it defines the qualifications and benefits and powers of the presidency. The president must be at least 35 years old and must have resided in the United States for no fewer than 14 years. Presidents must be natural-born citizens. So what does that mean, natural-born? It means that they have to be born within the United States. And in the last few years, we've had several candidates for presidency who were born either on a military base or who were overseas when they were born. But natural born has meant to be that if you're born to U.S. citizens, even if you happen to be, at an embassy someplace else or a military base, as was the case with John McCain, you are a U.S. citizen and you do qualify to become president. The other thing I like is it talks about the compensation of the president and that it should never be increased during the term of that president. So you can increase the pay for the president, but it wouldn't take effect until the next president is elected. And in 2001, they doubled the salary to $400,000. In the 1960s, it had been $200,000 a year. Section 1 of that Article 2 talks about executive power. Okay, and that power shall be vested in a president of the United States, and he shall hold that office for a term of 4 years. And what is executive power? And I'm going to play you a little clip here, then we're gonna talk some more about that executive power. But I think this can really encapsulate what some people might think of as the executive power.
Good morning, Mr. President.
What do we got?
3 retaliatory strike scenarios.
When are they operational?
At the President's command.
No prep time.
We're there.
All 3 scenarios are comprehensive, meet the obligations of proportional response, and pose minimum risk to American personnel and assets. Scenario 1, or Pericles 1, to use its code name, sir.
What is the virtue of a proportional response?
I'm sorry?
What is the virtue of a proportional response? Why is it good? They hit an airplane, so we hit a transmitter, right? That's a proportional response.
Sir, in the case of Pericles 1...
They hit a barracks, we hit 2 transmitters.
That's roughly it, yes, sir.
This is what we do. This is what we do.
Yes, sir. It's what we do. It's what we've always done.
Well, if it's what we do, if it's what we've always done, don't they know we're going to do it?
Sir, if you turn your attention to Pericles 1.
I have turned my attention to Pericles 1. It's 2 ammo dumps, an abandoned railroad bridge, and a Syrian intelligence agency.
Those are 4 highly rated targets, sir.
But they know we're going to do that. They know we're going to do that. Those areas have been abandoned for 3 days now. We know that from the satellite, right? We have the intelligence.
Sir.
They did that, so we did this. It's the cost of doing business. It's been factored in, right?
Mr. President.
Am I right, or am I missing something here?
No, sir, you're right, sir.
Then I ask again, what is the virtue of a proportional response?
It isn't virtuous, Mr. President. It's all there is, sir.
It is not all there is.
Sir, Admiral Fitzwallace.
Excuse me, Leo. Pardon me, Mr. President. Just what else is there?
The disproportional response. Let the word ring forth from this time and this place, gentlemen. You kill an American, any American, we don't come back with a proportional response. We come back with total disaster.
Mr. President, are you suggesting we carpet bomb Damascus?
I am suggesting, General, that you and Admiral Fitzwallace and Secretary Hutchison and the rest of the national security team take the next 60 minutes and put together an American response scenario that doesn't make me think we are just docking somebody's damn allowance.
So this clip really highlights just that raw power of the presidency. Now, later in this episode, President Bartlett, and this is from show West Wing, but he calms down and does the responsible thing after he's shown what the actual massive devastation that he could order would have caused and how that would have really amped things up beyond control. The thing is, if there isn't a responsible person in the office of the presidency, things can go really off the rails. And we've seen that happen. We're seeing it happen, frankly, right now. Presidents have tremendous power that's vested within them. And there are no guardrails. You know, at the beginning of the Trump presidency, a lot of people who supported President Trump said, well, you know, we've got these, great people who are serving with him. They'll keep him contained. They don't understand the power of the presidency. The president, if he gives an order, now he can't, blatantly tell somebody to break the law, but the law, especially in cases of this clip, a retaliatory strike or military action against an adversary, the power that the president have is pretty unlimited. And if those military officers do not obey that direct command, they can go to jail. So it's one of those things where there aren't very many guardrails on the presidency. And it's one of these things that's going to come up here a few times. We really need to make sure we as voters are the guardrails and pick people who have the right temperament. Maybe not always agree with, but have the right temperament for the audience. So one of the big things about the American presidency is we have to put it in context. The framers of the Constitution knew exactly who they wanted to be president and designed the office around him. And of course, that was George Washington. He was the man they created the position for. They developed a chief executive who not only was the operating officer of the country, but was also the head of state. This meant that he not only made sure the proverbial trains ran on time in the federal government, he's the one who greeted those passengers when they got off. And they also gave this, commander-in-chief role to the president because, again, George Washington was our commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War. He had the military record. He was highly respected. He was shown to not abuse power. And so they put all this massive power in his hands. He laid down his sword after the Revolutionary War. He said, I've served my country. I'm going to go back home to Mount Vernon. That is a rarity in nations, a rarity in times of revolutions, that the person who could have had dominant political power just lays it down. He wanted to follow the example of Cincinnatus, who twice was given dictatorial power by the Roman Republic, and once he had successfully taken out the danger to Rome, laid down that supreme power. He actually did it once in one day. He was given dictatorial powers in the morning, went out, led a successful battle, and then laid those powers back down that same day. They gave this tremendous, unbridled power to General Washington, who became President Washington, and the only unanimously elected president as well. Maybe not putting enough thought into who and what comes after President Washington. But the whole head of state thing is also something that we need to talk about. It's important because most democracies and republics have a political leader and another person who's the head of state, because they're two different positions and they have vastly different duties and responsibilities. So the German government, you hear of a chancellor, so we have Chancellor Angela Merkel, but there's also a head of state who's the president of Germany, who you hear very little. Because again, they do the ceremonial duties. They're supposed to be the position that, unless there's a time of crisis, because sometimes in times of crisis, the president has a little bit more power or more specific power dealing in times of crisis. But in your everyday, normal, legislative type thing, they're not involved with that. Because they're supposed to be that individual the nation can look to be, an honest broker of the truth. Great Britain, again, another example. You have a prime minister who is the head of government, head of their political party, and that's also with, the Chancellor of Germany. They're the head of government because, they're head of their political party as well. And in Great Britain, as we know, the Queen is the head of state. Okay, has no political power, has no legislative power, but again, is that figurehead for, people to kind of rally around in times of crisis, or, somebody who, kind of does those ceremonial things of helping to work on better relations between countries. When the presidency was created in the Constitution, they never considered political parties. Washington detested political parties. So the original president was head of state and government. Every president since has been the head of state, head of government, and also the head of a political party or the chief representative of a political party. That political party position is what made the head of state position less noble and far less objective over time. So Section 2 states that the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy and the militias of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. So we have state National Guards, but those National Guards can be federalized when the president deems it important enough to do so. One of the other unlimited powers that a president has is the pardon ability that they're invested with by the Constitution. So they are allowed to pardon people who have committed federal crimes, anybody. And it's also believed that a president could pardon themselves from a federal crime. And what we saw with President Nixon, and then when he resigned the office, President Ford gave a pardon to President Nixon for any potential crimes that he may have conducted before he was even charged. So that's one of the other nuances. A lot of people think, okay, well, they might have heard of a governor pardoning somebody who had served, so much jail time or showed remorse or what have you. These pardon powers, especially the presidential federal pardon power, it's really unlimited. They can pardon anybody at any point in time, whether they've been charged, no reason whatsoever. And they can even do a blanket pardon of, hey, I pardon you of any potential federal crime that you may have ever done in the past. Just completely blanket that way. It's something that a number of presidents, including our current president, have been accused of abusing for political or personal advantage. Another big thing that the president can do is negotiate treaties. Now, there's some guardrails on that. You can't just go out and say, hey, I love great Ethiopian coffee, which Ethiopian coffee is phenomenal, and do a treaty that's going to get him a great personal supply of coffee from Ethiopia. But what he can do is, put these treaties together, and many of them are, obviously incredibly complex, but they have to be approved by the Senate. And 2/3 of the Senate has to approve them. So oftentimes, especially in modern presidencies, getting actual treaties ratified has become incredibly difficult. We have fewer and fewer treaties, just as we have fewer and fewer actual declared wars. I mean, our last declared war was World War II. Our war in Korea was called a police action, and my father, who served in that war, said, he wasn't over there arresting anybody. Vietnam, First Gulf War, Grenada, we invaded Panama, Second Gulf War, invading Afghanistan, all these differing military actions, none of them have officially been a war. And on the flip side, we have fewer and fewer treaties that are actually passed because it's harder to get 2/3 of the Senate to approve those treaties. One of the biggest, most important powers and long-lasting powers of a presidency that for a very long time hadn't been given the same importance as probably a number of their other powers is the power to appoint. So obviously, they create their own cabinet, they appoint, their own Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Attorney General, there's a whole litany of those types of offices. But there's 4,000 actual political appointments in the federal government. And those have, again, at certain times, and we're going to discuss this in a minute or two here, but those have been manipulated for political purpose as well. The thing that's really, come to bear, because right now we're in the midst of a open Supreme Court position that President Trump has made an appointment to, and that appointee is going through the senatorial confirmation process as I'm recording this episode. There's also dozens and sometimes hundreds of other federal judges that the president appoints. So when you look at the 4,000 plus political appointments, you look at the entire federal court system, you look at ambassadorships, a whole litany of things. And then what many consider to be the grand prize of being able to appoint a Supreme Court justice. President Trump, this will be his third Supreme Court pick. 1/3 of the entire Supreme Court, assuming it stays at 9 justices, 1/3 are going to be Trump judges who are going to serve for decades and decades to come. I might be long gone before some of these people even leave the Supreme Court. Federal judges serve for life as well. You have appeals courts throughout this entire nation. And the Supreme Court cases get all the press, but appeals courts and other federal courts are the ones who provide the vast majority of the federal laws that we live under. Seeing if they're, constitutional or not, or if they've overreached or whatever it may be. Their judgments are what we live under. Donald Trump has appointed more of those justices in less than one full term in office than other presidents have. Even if he loses the election this year and is out in January, Trump's impact, whether you like that or you don't like it, his impact will be with us for generations to come. The power of the presidency, again, is tremendous. Give the Republicans kudos on this, because for decades, they've really taken that and run with it. They have made it a big selling point for Republican candidates at really all levels of government, whether it's state houses, state governorships, federal offices, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency. They've used it as a prime motivating factor. Again, whether you like it or not, they have done a much better job than Democrats have of making these court appointments, which have a vastly bigger impact on lives than any single presidential term. One of the other things I think is kind of funny, and I didn't run the clip from the West Wing, but they did a pretty good job with it. State of the Union, or what we call the State of the Union now, because in Section 3 of Article 2, they talk that the president should give an update to Congress, and that's evolved into this State of the Union speech that's given the beginning of each year of a president's term. And in the West Wing, one of the episodes, they said, well, really all he's required to do is say, hey, the U.S. is fine, and you can write it on the back of a cocktail napkin and hand it over. And literally, it's like a lot of the Constitution, it is wide open to interpretation. We have just followed a regular and standard tradition of giving a State of the Union address. But it is important, again, with that communication between the differing branches of the federal government. So if you kind of break down the four main areas the four main areas of responsibility the president has, one is military power, second is diplomatic power, third, the appointment power, which is pretty tremendous, and then the legislative power. And we're going to kind of just briefly go over those four, and I'll try not to repeat myself here, but I think it's pretty important to look at it from this standpoint. The big thing on the military power, and this is where the founding fathers thought this would be a good check and balance so that you don't get a commander, general or an admiral who looked upon the military as their own weapon. So it was important to them to have the president, and again, it was based on President Washington, but for a civilian to be in charge of the military. So a civilian is the commander in chief. That was really important to balance out that power, because you have military establishments. You can have, a 3-4-star general who's been in the military for decades, built up a strong following within that military. You want to make sure that you have that civilian oversight, and that civilian oversight changes every 4 to 8 years at this point. That is a pretty good, innovative way of having a little bit of balance of power in that. And one of the things, one of the interesting facts about President Washington is, as president, he actually led troops into battle as president and their commander-in-chief. He took that role literally. The diplomatic power, again, we talked about creating treaties that have to get ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, speaking with foreign ambassadors, and we have obviously a much more formal process of how that goes. But oftentimes you would have ambassadors who would, from foreign countries, especially larger countries or allies of the country or allies of the United States, that would speak oftentimes directly to the president. Now, again, that doesn't happen quite as much because we have a much more formalized process with the State Department, or I should say at least we did, because, again, under President Trump, so many of those norms have been blown out of the water. Having the president appoint ambassadors makes sense from the standpoint that the president will be appointing people that the president knows, trusts, and it's a good gateway to these other foreign countries. It's looked on negatively because the president, if they're appointing, their best buddy from high school, may not be the best person for the job, or somebody who gave him, $3 million in campaign contributions, again, may not be the most qualified for the job. And both Democrats and Republicans have appointed people to ambassadorships that objectively probably didn't deserve to be there. The appointment power, again, incredibly important. We talked about that extensively. One of the things with the appointment power, and when it really started to turn, and again, I'm sure there was some of this before President Andrew Jackson, who I'm going to kind of lay the biggest blame at, I guess, because President Andrew Jackson, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but had something, a statement or a quote, something along the line of, if you can't find a Democrat to do the job, then the job doesn't need to be done. And of course, he was a Democrat. So he really turned it into a patronage system where you'll get this job if you supported me or you helped me or what have you. And that's where a lot of these appointments, whether to ambassadorships or to whatever, really got manipulated. President Abraham Lincoln also used some of that appointing power to essentially bribe people when he was trying to pass differing things during the Civil War as well. So a lot of presidents have manipulated that system. We hope that we get the best possible people in these positions. But again, both parties have abused that appointment power to their political advantage. Now, the legislative power, which we really didn't talk about, the president has the ability to veto legislation. That veto legislation would have to get overridden by both houses of Congress with a 2/3 vote. So they gave the president really supreme executive power. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit here about how that really expanded over time. But supreme executive power gave them really a huge outsized impact in the court system. So that judicial branch, our three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. So he is the executive, in this case, President Trump. Should say he or she, because hopefully we'll soon have a female president. But we have an executive power which is pretty much unlimited. We have the president appointing the judges who, yes, always reflect more of the president's judicial mind, but at times seems to be even further of specific positions and policies in line with the president versus being just a great thinker about what the United States judicial system should be like. So you have a tremendous amount of impact on the judicial system by a president, and they also have a tremendous impact on the legislative branch. And the veto power and the fact it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress to override a presidential veto, which again, when they were putting this together, they really didn't think strongly of how political parties could potentially impact this. But in order to override a presidential veto, get those 2/3 in both houses, it doesn't happen that often. And a president can't create legislation, can't introduce legislation. Now, the political party that president is a member of oftentimes puts legislation up that the president wants to see. But a president has great control over what goes through Congress, because if a president threatens to veto it and the president's party is in power in at least one of the houses, then the president really has tremendous power over the legislative branch of our government, which is one of the reasons why legislative power in our country is so diminished, especially under a more modern vision of what the presidency is. So who we elect as president fundamentally is the person who sets the entire agenda, not just for the executive, but for the judicial and the legislative, and has the biggest impact for generations to come when it comes to the federal court system. So when they say that the office of the presidency is the most powerful position in the entire world, they're 100% correct. So we're going to move on to the second part here. How do we pick a president? And I'm a huge fan of Winston Churchill, and I could not find the direct quotes in his own voice. So there's a place where they do Winston Churchill quotes, and they kind of make it sound old-timey in it. So this is an actor portraying Winston Churchill. But how we pick a president is critically important, because many people believe that we're a democracy. We're not. It came to light in a big way this last week or so with Senator Lee from Utah saying, well, elections aren't there to, promote democracy. They're there to get us, the outcomes that are the best for our country. And he's not wrong. I mean, it's terrible for us to think that, okay, well, we don't want the most democratic view. And I want the most, democratic process we can have. People need to vote, and those votes should matter. And we're really going to get into that in this segment. But the idea that our Constitution, one, gives you any right to vote for president, which it absolutely does not. And I stressed that tremendously in my previous podcast, episode 49. There is absolutely zero words in the United States Constitution or any amendment that says we get to directly elect our president. Okay? It is a preference vote, and that's about it. Now, many states, and again, tradition, have said that whoever carries the popular vote in a state, or Maine and Nebraska do it by congressional district, whoever gets that popular vote gets those electoral votes. But that is by tradition and state laws. The federal government doesn't ensure that. There's no federal law that says that, and the Constitution absolutely does not say that. So here's something from Churchill that is a little bit of, I think, the framers of the Constitution's thoughts as well.
Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter.
It really does carry the day when the Constitution was created. In every other office in the country, so when I ran for mayor, I'm running for school board now, when I ran for city council, it's a direct election. Those voters, they are electing me to represent them in whatever that particular local office is. Same way in state offices. You're electing your state representative, your state senator, your governor. You're voting for that person. And if they get the most votes, they win. United States senators used to not be directly elected, but that was changed turn of the last century, where U.S. senators were actually directly elected, just like representatives in the House. The president, however, is not, and never has been directly elected. The process generally was, okay, you vote in the election, and then whoever won that popular vote, those electors, people who were selected by either party, which is the system we have now, that either party selects their slate of electors for each state, and then whichever presidential candidate gets the most popular votes, then that, so if it's, in this case, if Joe Biden wins the state of Wisconsin, their electors who are on the Democratic slate then go to the electoral college get together. But they are the ones, they cast votes, and then we would assume, and again, they don't have to, but we would assume then they would cast the electoral votes for the state of Wisconsin for Joe Biden. Now, that's only happens that way because those states have set up that system. So we'll go through the nuts and bolts here fairly quickly. So each state gets as many electors as they have Congress members and senators. So state of Washington has 12 electors, Florida has 29, Texas has 38, The Wisconsin, like I had used as an example, has 10. Minnesota has 10. California has 55. So they have that many members in Congress, House members and senators combined. Now you need 270 electors to become president. 48 states and Washington, D.C., who does also get to put forth an elector for president. They're winner-take-all states. And as I stated briefly before, Maine and Nebraska assign their electors in a proportional system between the total vote and then the House of Representatives district within their state. So the Electoral College always is brought to the forefront when people are either worried that somebody won't win the popular vote, but will still win the Electoral College, which has happened in the United States in 2000, 2016, and also 3 times in the 1800s. So that's kind of a sticky situation because many people think of us as quote unquote a democracy, which we certainly aren't. And it also gets in the situation which I discussed in a previous podcast about how the electors are not represented, that some states have a much bigger impact on presidential elections. North Dakota, Wyoming, those states which have 3 electoral votes, but, have the population of, or actually the less than the total population of many cities in some of the larger states. So they have an outsized impact on voting for president. They also have an outsized impact in Congress. Once in our history, they did not receive enough electoral votes, even in this kind of confused and non-representative way that the Electoral College selects a president. That was the election in 1824, when it was between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. To make it even more controversial, John Quincy Adams and the head of the House of Representatives were accused of making a deal so that they would throw their support behind John Quincy Adams for favors and political office so that he would become president. And he was the son of John Adams. So it can get really messy, and we can absolutely end up with a situation where, and in that period of time in the United States, you had a lot of regional candidates. So you might have 4 people running, and each one of those candidates might get electoral votes. And if they couldn't come up with a way to do enough horse trading to get one person over the top, it would get thrown to the House of Representatives, which it did in 1824. You can also have a tie, which unfortunately doesn't help anybody. And that would also cause it to get thrown to the House of Representatives. So the process is the House of Representatives votes for president. And they don't vote by how many members, because people are thinking, well, gosh, if it went that way, the Democrats now control the House of Representatives, and it looks like they would control the House of Representatives going into next year as well. But it's not by the total members of Congress. It's actually by state delegations. So the Republicans actually control 26 state delegations, and you vote as a state delegation. So it's another one of these things where these small states have a massively outsized impact to who gets elected as president, even in this kind of extreme situation where somebody doesn't win the Electoral College outright. So even though the Speaker of the House is a Democrat, and they have a good majority of members in the House that are Democrats, and that allows them to control the process in the House in every other situation, in this one particular situation, it does not. And then also, to make it a little bit more confusing, the Senate gets to pick the vice president. So let's get back to those pesky electors, right? So 29 states in the District of Columbia have said the electors must follow the popular vote. So this means that if Donald Trump wins the popular vote in Florida, he gets all those electors because in Florida, they have passed such a law. But what that also means is that 21 states have no requirement. There is not a requirement in the state of Minnesota, where I live, that says an elector has to follow the popular vote, which again seems a little bit crazy to me, but you can have what are called faithless electors, and they can, pick John Smith if they theoretically wanted to. Some states have tried to, and it's very rare, and I should throw that out there. I mean, it's exceptionally rare when somebody doesn't vote for the person who has the popular vote. So on the one hand, you can say, well, tradition has held us, together. It's been firm that those electors vote for the winner of the popular vote. But we also live in a day and age where no tradition has really held us together, and the norms have all been shattered. The other thing that we should really be looking at, and I shouldn't forget too, and even in those states where they do bind the electors to the popular vote, the punishments in most of those states are very minimal. So if you wanted to vote for, like I said, John Smith, you can do that. It's not like you're going to go to jail for 20 years or anything. So the truly terrifying part of this is that the Constitution says states get to determine. Okay, that's really all it says. States get to determine their process for giving their electoral votes. So even in those states, so let's pick on Florida because, well, why not? Florida is so easy to pick on in a lot of these cases. The Republican legislature and the Republican governor could, the day after the election, so let's say Joe Biden wins Florida, could literally the day after the election say, hey, you know what? We feel that Trump just didn't get a fair shake. We are going to exercise our constitutional authority and take the power back and put it with the legislature to decide who gets our electoral votes. The 29 electoral votes of Florida could be given to Trump, even though he didn't win the popular vote in Florida. Now, this is crazy and way out in left field someplace, but the whole last 4 years have been crazy. I'm not going to say it couldn't happen. It would be pretty bizarre. It would be, I would hope to God it wouldn't be legal or constitutional, but as we're listening to years of Supreme Court nominees, and then when they become justices, saying that they're going to interpret only what the written word in the Constitution says, which has led to decisions where even if a person who's been convicted of a crime is innocent, that is no reason to overturn the guilty verdict. And save us all, but that's actually been used in Supreme Court decisions. Okay? So the actual words in the Constitution say that the state can determine however they want. I mean, they could, throw up a coin and say, hey, if it's heads, it's Republican. If it's, tails, it's, the Democrat. And that might pass constitutional muster because if it's the system that the state's legislature and governor, they've voted on and approved and written into law, that's constitutional. And I'm just going to keep saying this because there is reform that has to occur here. We do not directly elect, nor do we have any constitutional protection, authority, guidance, anything that says we as individuals are really actually voting for the president. We're voting in a system that everybody through tradition and practice have said this is how we do it. Those who follow and use the pure power standard may decide to cross that Rubicon. So I just wanted to kind of highlight, and I beat this drum pretty good in a previous podcast as well, and I'm going to pick on the state of Wyoming to kind of go over this example, and this was done in 2008, so the population numbers are off by a little bit, but Wyoming's not a striving, thriving population center, so our population in Wyoming is pretty close to the number used here. But to kind of show the impact of smaller population states on the electoral college process. So in 2008, an average electoral vote was comparable to about 570,000 people. Okay, it's 565,166. Wyoming has 3 electoral votes, and they only had 532,668 citizens. So that means they had 1 electoral vote per 177,556 people. That's 318% more than those states that are hitting that average, and far more than a state like California, which, forgive my language, is totally screwed, whether it's in Congress because of their huge population and in the Electoral College. Even though they have by far the biggest amount of electoral votes, 55, it is in no way comparable to all these smaller states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Montana. All those states, which are predictably and reliably Republican, have a much higher percentage of impact, whether it comes to the Senate or it comes to the House, because again, they're individual, even though many of them only have 1 U.S. representative, they don't come anywhere near the population threshold that California does. And they certainly have a much bigger and outsized impact on the electoral college process. Now, this is the bargain. This is the rules of the game. We all know this, but that still doesn't mean that it's fair, and it does need to get reformed, because at a certain point, these numbers are going to be even worse than they are today. And we can't continue to have a government, a federal government, that is followed, respected, and held up as a positive in a political process that continues to have minority support from the American public. That's minority voting support from the American public. If we continue a process where the majority of people are voting for a different person by millions of votes, that's an unsustainable system of government. We need to reform the Electoral College. We need to reform how differing states are represented in Congress. We can't continue to have states that have a few 100,000 people have just as many senators as a state that might have 40 million people. It's not sustainable. It's a flawed system. It was flawed when it was created, like many things in the Constitution. Okay, in the original Constitution, I hear this argument of, well, this is how it was set up in the original Constitution. Well, slavery was set up in the original Constitution. Only white men who owned property, could participate in government in the original Constitution. We need to get beyond that idea. We need to make our electoral and representative bodies actually representative of the people. And that gets to that whole, what kind of government are we, right? Well, we're a constitutional federal republic, meaning that we have a constitution, an actual written constitution, and there are countries that don't have written constitutions, but we have a written constitution that sets out the framework and the laws that all of our political organizations, governmental organizations have to operate within. Okay, we got that part. The federal is because we're not one nation so much as we're 50 differing states and a number of other territories in the District of Columbia. We have many differing laws and rules in each of these 50 states. So we are a federal, we're a grouping of those 50 states under one federal government. And there are certain things that the federal government has control over, and there are certain things that the states have control over. And republic means that we elect people to make decisions for us. So even in local government, where I've served and hope to serve again, people vote for me to make decisions. Sometimes they don't like the decisions you make. Sometimes they believe that, well, you should just do what we say because we elected you. But there's a line that I use from Edmund Burke that says that essentially boils down to that you as a representative are supposed to use all of your knowledge and expertise to make the right decision. You're not supposed to just follow what, people might think of in that particular instance. Okay. So I fully get and understand when people are like, well, we wanted you to do this. So we are that constitutional federal republic, and we should understand that. We can make it a much more democratic federal republic, a much more democratic constitutional federal republic, by having things like direct elections of presidents and having a much more representative Congress to reflect the will of the people. Because you can't say that 500,000 people in one state get 2 senators and 40 million people in another state get 2 senators and that be representative. And yes, I know the whole argument. The House of Representatives is actually representative because it's by population, but even that's not true. The state of Wyoming gets a representative for much fewer people, right, than each individual representative in the state of California. California should have many more representatives in the House of Representatives. If you want to use, there should only be 2 senators for each state, regardless of population, then you must fix the formula for representatives in the House of Representatives, because those higher population states deserve more representatives in there if you want to keep senators at 2 senators per state. We need to start reflecting that. But let's move on to the third area I want to discuss, and that's how has the office of the president changed over time. I'm going to play a little bit of Plato from Plato's Republic here. It has a certain degree of logic behind what's going to be said here of why, the founders of the Constitution maybe were correct in not trusting the great masses to vote. But just take a listen here.
We're used to thinking very highly of democracy, and by extension of ancient Athens, the civilization that gave rise to it. The Parthenon has become almost a byword for democratic values, which is why so many leaders of democracies like to be photographed there. It's therefore very striking to discover that one of ancient Greece's greatest achievements, philosophy, was highly suspicious of its other achievement, democracy. The founding father of Greek philosophy, Socrates, is portrayed in the dialogues of Plato as hugely pessimistic about the whole business of democracy. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato describes Socrates falling into conversation with a character called Adimantus and trying to get him to see the flaws of democracy by comparing a society to a ship. If you were heading out on a journey by sea, asks Socrates, who would you ideally want deciding who was in charge of the vessel? Just anyone, or people educated in the rules and demands of seafaring? The latter, of course, says Adimantus. So why then, responds Socrates, do we keep thinking that any old person should be fit to judge who should be the ruler of a country? Socrates' point is that voting in an election is a skill, not a random intuition. And like any skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizenry vote without an education is as irresponsible as putting them in charge of a trireme sailing to Samos in a storm.
A pretty good argument, I think, and kind of goes with Churchill's lines about, the best argument against democracy is 5 minutes with the average voter. Plato puts forth, the argument that it should be a skill. So it wasn't saying that, you had to be a certain race or a certain age or a certain whatever, but you had to be essentially an informed voter. Now, of course, where that gets a little slippery is, who's teaching you to vote? What do they think you should be voting for? And Plato's Republic is interesting because it was basically a lot of old guys over 80 who got the supreme powers. And, I guess we're getting pretty close there with both of our presidents being of advanced age, we'll say. So I played that here because it really was in line with a lot of the founders of our country and those who put the Constitution together. Alexander Hamilton was a huge impact, on the creation of the Constitution. He was the main author of the Federalist Papers, and then also put together one of the first political parties as well, and became our first Secretary of the Treasury, and did great things. A lot of people have fallen in love with Alexander Hamilton because of the play, and God love Lin-Manuel, but he did a bit of a disservice to history because Alexander Hamilton, who I do think was phenomenal, had a lot of, I would say, dark and negative traits as well that really reflected, his time for sure. But he was a much more complicated individual than what was even portrayed in the play. And I guess I'm a supporter that anybody gets interested in Alexander Hamilton, because without him, we may not have had the United States of America or a constitution for me to gripe about in my podcast. But Alexander Hamilton agreed with Plato. He did not trust the average regular person to make the right decision. And most of the founding fathers didn't either. And again, we talked about that in my last podcast, and there's plenty of examples there if you want to give that a listen, and please do. So they didn't believe in democracy. They believed in a republic. They believed that it should be, essentially an oligarchy of white men who own property making those decisions and picking people for those important offices. And I think there's, quite a bit of that floating around today as well, unfortunately. I talked, quite a bit about the constitutional federal republic form of government. And it's another one of those institutions that was created before the advent of really organized political parties in our country. And the Constitution, it was a battle of a lot of regional interest, economic interest, and, all those devolve into politics at some point. Whether slavery was going to be enshrined in the Constitution, which it was, how our big populated states going to have their power muted a little bit so that the smaller states would want to get on board, which leads to a lot of the inequities we have today in our congressional and electoral process. But these were a lot of compromises. And at the time, they really had to be created so that the country could be formed. You weren't going to get smaller states to agree to be essentially subservient to large states because they were looked upon, and they looked upon themselves as being almost distinct countries, not one area of a whole. Whereas today we look at the United States as being the whole, and we certainly come from these differing states, but our allegiance is to the country as a whole, not to the state of Wisconsin or Texas, or, well, maybe people in Texas still have a great allegiance to Texas. But most people look at this as being an allegiance to the country first. Well, during the formation of the country and the Constitution, a lot of people did look at loyalty to their state first because we were a federal government and we didn't have a lot of the mechanisms of government to kind of bind everybody together. And that's what led to a lot of people deciding who they're going to fight for in the Civil War, where people look to their state as their deeper loyalty than to the country as a whole. So, I did talk a little bit about how the presidency is really the dominant force in our government, and that didn't happen overnight, obviously. Article 1, again, gave most of that power to Congress, and for a significant period of time, Congress controlled most things. The presidency, as we look at it today, really wasn't formed until you get, to FDR and after that. It was created to be a weaker of the two between the legislature and the presidency. The presidency was supposed to be weaker. So how did we go from Congress having all the power to the president being, at times a figurehead, to being, the person who kind of just carried out the orders of Congress? And that's how a lot of presidents looked at the position, is that, they were the chief executive, meaning that they were given their orders. This is what Congress had passed, and they had to try to do that to the best of their ability while looking out for the country's international, diplomatic, and, sometimes military affairs. So there's two and possibly three weaknesses that I kind of talked to and referred to them a little bit before. But the weaknesses are the congressional system. It's not the swiftest. So when there are times of crisis, Congress is not going to act very swiftly on anything of any detailed measure. After we were bombed by the Japanese before World War II, Congress the next day declared war, which was obviously a pretty quick vote for Congress to take, but all the mechanisms to make that happen weren't even remotely thought of at the time. And we see this in our daily lives. If you're part of any group or committee, or heck, if you're 2-3 families going on vacation together, when we were actually able to do that kind of thing and you were trying to decide what you're going to do for the day, you could have 2 hours of everybody trying to figure out what all of us can do together. So having one person making those decisions is obviously much swifter. And then Congress ceded powers over time to the president because of the slowness of this action, and also, frankly, from lack of consensus with their members. There was a fair degree of Congress over time kind of passing the buck. Hey, we don't want to be blamed if this goes awry, so hey, why don't you, president person, you take the ball and run with it. Now, if you screw up, we're going to be the first ones to say, hey, you screwed up, for sure. But if you're successful, we're going to say, hey, well, you know what? That's what we wanted to do all along. So there is some of that involved with it as well. But really, one of the biggest factors of Congress ceding power to presidents is when one, if not both, of the chambers of Congress are the same political party as the president. So if your president is a Democrat and both chambers, the House and the Senate, are held by Democratic majorities, they're going to be much more open to following the president's lead because, again, not only is the president the head of government and the head of state, but they are essentially the head of that political party as well. So if some Congress member wants to get reelected and they're in a strong Republican, or excuse me, in this case, a strong Democratic district, and the president comes out against them, they're not going to have a whole lot of chance of getting reelected. So they kind of toe the line. And that's where that political party affiliation really causes an eroding of legislative power. Because our founders had said that the presidency, as well as the legislative authority in Congress, they would be the two sides of the coin. That there would be the butting of heads between those two. That a senator from New York and a senator from Georgia are both senators. And they're going to guard their power. They're going to protect their power. They're not going to let some clown in the Oval Office dictate to the Senate what they're going to do. Now, the two different sides of a coin aren't Congress and the presidency. It's Republican and Democrat. It doesn't matter that legislative prerogative gets trampled by the executive, which it has. And again, I'm not just laying this all at the feet of Republicans during this current presidential term, because it's happened in many presidential terms where the party of the president, if they control Congress, essentially gives way. And you can point to examples where they didn't, but in most cases they give way. Therefore, the president is strengthened in their power. But there are really five presidents that kind of laid the groundwork. I should say there's four that laid the groundwork, and the fifth one really ran with the ball. I think that might be the better way to say it. So the first one was Andrew Jackson, and I spoke about him earlier where, he had that line of if a Democrat can't be found to do the job in the federal government, we don't need the job. And he used that patronage to build up that Democratic Party. President Jackson also did something that really, exercised and flexed presidential power in a battle with South Carolina, which was a state that he would have a natural affinity with. But South Carolina tried to nullify a federal tariff. And the president wasn't going to let this happen. He used his veto power. He even threatened to march troops down to South Carolina at one point. Some historians think that this could have been the spark of the Civil War, but if it weren't for President Jackson's, brute force and strong personality, we could have gone into the Civil War earlier, but he prevented it with his strong actions. So that was the first, really big, hey, I'm the president. I am going to flex all the powers that I can muster to make an individual state, an individual region to back down. And then that makes it easier for the next person. So Abraham Lincoln, who is obviously a great president for many reasons, he also has flaws. He also had very anti-democratic leanings. Now, we can excuse this because of the Civil War, but if you don't uphold things during time of crisis, are you able to in times of peace? And does that lay the groundwork for us to just forget about who we are as a country when it does come to war? And again, Abraham Lincoln is a tremendous individual, as another person who is a personal hero of mine. But he suspended habeas corpus, which is the right of an appearance in court. And he jailed anybody who he deemed to be disloyal. Now, that is not what we would expect from, a person whose face is on Mount Rushmore. He also used the appointment power to bribe, essentially, people to go his way on differing items as well. And he ignored Congress. He expanded the army without congressional approval. He blockaded ports. He did all kinds of things. He essentially ruled the country as if Congress didn't exist at times, and many times. But it was during a time of war, and he used his commander-in-chief role, and he used the ability by saying that we were in a time that the nation needed. And I'm not saying that we weren't in a time of crisis as a nation, but he essentially trampled all over the Constitution to protect the Constitution, which we're not going to go into how slippery of a slope that is. But that is one of the big lead-ups to how Congress became less and less important. it reminds me of a quote, or I'm going to paraphrase to the best of my ability, that Stalin had. When the Pope had said something that he didn't like and, he wasn't going to follow it or whatever. And they said, well, you don't really want to go to battle against the Pope. And Stalin said, well, how many tanks does he have? How many divisions does he have? Congress has no ability. Now they have sergeant at arms, and theoretically they can imprison somebody who does not appear before them, or that kind of thing. And they can actually they have arresting powers, but that was hardly ever used in the past and certainly isn't now. But they don't have that whole infrastructure to do that. President Lincoln had the entire Union Army plus all of his other federal powers. And when it comes down to it, quote another person, Napoleon, you don't win at the peace table or at the negotiating table what you haven't won on the battlefield. So we'll get off all these quotes now. So the next one is Theodore Roosevelt, who I just outright think is an incredibly impressive individual and president. Again, has flaws like all of us do. He expanded the presidency. He did it in a way, though, that was a little bit different. He basically told Congress that, okay, I'm going to do this because I think I have this power to do it, and this is the way it's going to be. So it was a little bit, I guess, nicer way of doing it, but he still took on more powers into the presidency than it had before. He did it in a civil way. He did it in a, I guess, almost collaborative way, but only collaborative in the way that I'm letting you know I'm taking these powers. So that was kind of interesting. And he helped to mold legislation before it really got going. So basically in its creation, President Wilson did the same thing, essentially wrote bills and presented them to Congress. And both of them had a very high standing on the international stage. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping end the Russo-Japanese War. So they both had these domestic strong policies and collaboration and kind of getting legislation going from the beginning through Congress. And they had that international. Woodrow Wilson was obviously, he was president during World War I, so he had a lot of national and international acclaim as well. And they both used the office to promote what they wanted to get done, but by doing that process, they advanced the powers of that office. So it was more incremental and, like I said, a little nicer way of doing it, but it did expand the office of the presidency. And then the person, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who won 4 elections, was president longer than anybody else, went through the Great Depression, World War II, tried to do some, ridiculous things by packing the court. And when we're talking packing the court, doubling the court, tripling the court, he really wanted to change things that way. Obviously with his New Deal and how it reordered the economy, creating Social Security, a lot of these differing things that really changed the perception of a president. He led from the front, as other presidents have done in different areas, but he was really seen as the face of the nation and the face of dramatic positive change within the country. So those 5 individuals, leading up to the first 4, then leading up to FDR, really changed the presidency. It started out with President Washington, who was just going to essentially execute what Congress had passed, to where the presidency was actively creating the legislation that they would then sign and enforce, with a court system that they had put together with all of their appointments and a federal government that was directed by their political appointees. So I often tell people who are concerned about government that it matters who we vote for. Now, that seems pretty obvious, so it's not a big rocket science kind of statement. But a lot of people say we just need to vote for a new person or somebody who agrees with us on this one issue. And not to worry, because, what change can 1 or 2 new people in any political body, what can it really do? We just don't like the way things are. We want to try something new. The system isn't going to fall apart. They're not going to really make anything a lot worse, but it matters so very much who gets elected in every position, whether it's a local council, a school board, a county commissioner, all the way through the state and federal offices. each person makes a tremendous impact, more than you might ever think. I have seen, and I've done it myself, where, we had a system in our local government that I vehemently disagreed with. I got elected, and essentially overnight, we changed things dramatically. Now, I obviously thought that was great. People who supported me thought that was great. But if you didn't like that, it's like, holy cow, this one person got elected and all these different things changed. It matters. It really does matter. And when it comes to the presidency, it matters tremendously. Voting for somebody who, hey, let's just give this person a try, can have significant. And as each new president shapes and changes the office, it should really be evidence to people that there are really very few limits in the office. Just limits on the quality and character of people who get elected and hold that office. Because the power of the presidency is fairly unlimited. Now, there might be significant consequences once the person leaves office. But when they're in office, they cannot be, just arrested or taken into custody. It doesn't happen that way. They have immunity. Last thing that I really want to go over is executive orders. Executive orders are a tool that have been used throughout our history. At times, these orders take form of legislation. A president is unable to get Congress to pass a law they want, or a law is passed that they sign, but then use an executive order to transform the law they wanted. The real power behind executive orders is that the president is the boss of the entire federal government machinery that is supposed to carry out laws passed by Congress. So what do you do when Congress says, paint the building blue, and the president says Congress wants the building painted blue, but I like red better? The president says, okay, we'll carry out the law passed by Congress to paint the building, but I'm ordering it to be painted red instead of blue. The people painting it paint it red because their boss said so. Now, that's a very simplistic kind of example, and we'll go into two others here that are more specific about differing, about things that have actually occurred. But that kind of lays out the fundamental issue here. Congress can pass whatever law it wants. But if the president decides not to enact it or to enact it differently, what are the controls on the president? And again, don't mean to pick on President Trump here too much, but President Trump has done this repeatedly. Just ignores subpoenas from Congress, simply just ignores their oversight authority at all. When before it was considered a big deal if a president wouldn't do that. So we're going to go over, two more examples here. That example is a pretty tame example, but here's one that's a little bit more recent. So Congress passed funds for the Department of Defense for such things as new schools on military bases. The president wanted money to build a wall on the Mexican border. The president signs a national emergency declaration and uses that power along with executive orders to redirect money from school construction to wall construction. He's spending the money Congress allocated to the Defense Department, but it's spending it how he wants. And then another example on the other side of the political spectrum, right? DACA was created by President Obama to protect minor children who were brought to the United States illegally. After years and several presidential administrations, Republicans and Democrats both tried to solve the issue of these minors and other immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the United States. It wasn't successful. So Obama used executive action. He set up the DACA program. Essentially, he created an entire system with the stroke of a pen. He used the power of the presidency to do it. And whether you approve DACA, don't approve DACA, and say that, well, gosh, Congress couldn't get their act together, so the president had no choice but to create a whole nother system using his, authority and executive powers to do so, it did a fundamental good. And yeah, okay, so it did a fundamental good. Abraham Lincoln won, the Civil War. He did it in part by being able to throw people in jail without giving them any reason. If they were disloyal, he could just lock them up. FDR, World War II, interned American citizens of Japanese descent. Wholly illegal and unconscionable, but he did it. And every time a president acts outside the law and creates maybe the best argument and giving, undocumented children in the United States a little more certainty in their life is a fundamental good. But the way that it was done further erodes the idea that Congress can pass any meaningful law. Because if we're just going to say, well, Congress can't get the job done, then what prevents future presidents from doing everything they can to make Congress not work or function properly so they can just rule as a dictator? I mean, we haven't had a federal budget for years and years. They just continually do continuing resolutions. You know, they might pass this little chunk over here, that little chunk over there. But we used to have a federal budget that was passed every year. Now we have this, you know, the heads of, you know, the Senate and the Congress will agree on a continuing resolution for another 3 months or 6 months. It's pure insanity. We jump from crisis to crisis now as if it's just a normal way to run a government. And it's not. We need what's called regular order to return to our federal government. These executive actions, executive orders, whether you like them, don't like them, as they say, where you stand on an issue depends where you sit. So if you're a Republican, you like it when Republican presidents do it. If you're a Democrat, you like it when Democratic presidents do it. It's just wrong. My favorite executive order is President Washington's first executive order. And he instructed the heads of his federal department to do as follows: to impress me with a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States. That's it. He basically was asking for their advice and do a darn good job letting me know how things are going and how we can make things better. And I'm just going to hit a couple of the presidents of how many executive orders they've done and kind of the average per year of executive orders, and show you we're not even anywhere near the most amount of executive orders on average per year. There were different times in American history where that was done. But I'm going to do that, and then we'll move on to our quiz, because I don't want this show to end up being 10 hours long. But I really think the point has to be made that ruling by decree, which essentially is what executive orders are, is not positive for our government. And it's one of those things that we as a country and voters and individuals need to take seriously on to the executive orders. So President Washington, who was president for 7.85 years, because, you know, his, when he first came into office, his first term was a little bit shorter because it was the first term. So he had a total of 8 executive orders, so basically 1 per year. John Adams had 1 executive order in 4 years. Thomas Jefferson, 4. Madison, 1. James Monroe, 1. Each of those served 8 years as well. John Quincy Adams, who served 4 years, had 3. And then, wow, it really explodes with 12 by Andrew Jackson. So we'll skip ahead here where it starts to pick up a little bit. So you get to Abraham Lincoln. He had 48 executive orders, which maybe makes some more sense because obviously we're fighting the Civil War. We had, you know, potentially good reason in his 4 years. So he had 12 per year, which first time we hit double digits. Then Andrew Johnson, who might be one of the worst presidents we've ever had, which is definitely saying some. He had 79 orders. So we hit the 20s. Ulysses S. Grant, who served for 8 years, had 217 executive orders. It's 27 per year. By far the most executive orders of any president. And then we go back down to a more normal number. And then we start trickling back up again to Chester Arthur, had 96. Cleveland's first, and gotta love him, the 2 non-consecutive terms. He had 113, Harrison 143, Cleveland 140. So you get into those bigger numbers, right? And then you get into Theodore Roosevelt, who was in office for 7.47 years because his first term was filling out McKinley's term because McKinley was assassinated. But he had over 1,000. So he had 145. Again, a significantly big number considering what previous presidents had done. And that kind of started a trend. We stay in the hundreds. You know, then we get to 225 with Wilson. We're still in the 200s. We hit 307 per year with Franklin Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt had 145 per year. So it's over 1,000. Wilson had almost 2,000 in his 8 years. Calvin Coolidge had 1,200. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt blew the top off of it all. He had 307 on average per year, which is the highest of any president. And he had 3,721 total orders. It was beyond, the average per year and obviously in total because he served so many years. Truman brought it back down to a little more reasonableness, I guess, of 117. And then you see this trend where it just keeps going down. And it gets less and less for each president until you get down to George H.W. Bush Sr. He only had 42 per year. And then we start kind of the climb. Clinton had 48. George W. Bush only had 36. Barack Obama had 35, and now Trump is up to 51 again. But again, very low numbers. So even though I kind of decry executive orders, and they are able to use other mechanisms within the executive branch to essentially do things that previous executive orders had done, but the overall number of executive orders have gone down quite a bit. Some of them are pretty big and have wide-ranging or much more wide-ranging impact than other previous executive orders, but it's gotten better. It's starting to creep back up again, and hopefully with future presidents, whether it's President Trump getting reelected or President Biden going forward, we can continue to curtail that number down to a much more reasonable number, and much more in the light of General Washington's, hey guys, go out there, do the best job you can do, help me help make America better. That's where we need to have the tone and tenor of executive orders lie, and not let's create whole new programs or rewrite funding bills or anything like that. So thank you for listening to that. I hope you found it informative. I hope you got a little bit more interested in the presidency. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email at george@georgewimmer.org. Reach out to me on any of their social media, and you'll hear all those coming up here shortly as well. So again, thank you for that. And now let's go. It's quiz time. There are 3 quiz questions. Each question is from this week's episode. Get your pencil, pen, or device ready to write down the answers. When you have completed the quiz, go to wimmerswilderness.org and fill out the quiz answer form on the quiz tab. You'll be entered to win the Wimmer's Wilderness Mason Jar Drinking Glass, Wimmer's Wilderness Recycled Cardboard Pen, and the very popular retractable, reusable straw. We also have a special gift to celebrate our 50th episode, a $50 gift card. Get your answers in by Friday, October 23rd. The quiz begins when the music plays. Quiz question number 1. How many electoral votes does it take to win the presidency? Quiz question number 2. How many executive orders did FDR issue? And question number 3. How many times has the House of Representatives chosen the president? Thank you for joining us today. Help us spread the word by telling your friends, family, and heck, even your frenemies that they can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Luminary, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio. Pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, you're going to find Wimmer's Wilderness. To learn more about us, go to wimmerswilderness.org. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Wimmer's Wilderness.